Steve Jobs once quoted, "Innovation is the only way to win." Now, to add a little weight to this, who is Steve Jobs? American entrepreneur, inventor, industrial designer, co-founder, chairman and CEO of Apple Incorporated, CEO, majority shareholder of Pixar, a businessman, a member of the Walt Disney Company's board of directors and CEO of Next Computer and Software Company. You with me? Looking at innovations in teaching, learning and assessment, we will firstly pose with the question, what makes your approach innovative? Now, the approach that has been used has not been implemented within the scheme of work being followed. A second consideration is that it's both new to myself as a practitioner and new to the learners engaging with the activity. Lastly, it could be considered innovative, as it's a different approach to teaching and learning to cover hard to master subject materials. As a group, we decided upon a blended learning approach. This was to increase student learning. Although this was our chosen pedagogy, each of us would individually tailor our sessions and activities to meet the needs of the learners in each of our groups. The group's main area of focus was to increase student learning. The skills we had hoped to develop in learners consisted of communication skills, group work skills, learner motivation, and computer literacy skills. A secondary area of focus would be employability skills. This could be linked in conjunction with cross-cutting themes to further increase student learning. Evidence-based research that has been used to inform our approach circulates around supporting literature and government policies. The government policies that have been explored address the importance of implementing employability skills in both further and higher education. Other policies provided by the Welsh Assembly Government also highlight the importance of incorporating more technology-based mediums into the learning environment. This is to further improve the students' learning experience. Literature that has been used to support the chosen blended learning approach states, "Educators need to see learners as individuals and design for difference, and play and discovery are becoming the means by which learners approach new concepts." Further reading has also been conducted to further support the planned learning activity. Learners this session is aimed at are a BTEC Level 3 group studying music practice. Learners in the group may have touched upon certain elements of the subject material being delivered. However, most materials being delivered will be relatively new to the majority of learners. All learners are of a mixed age group, with both mixed cultural and socio-economic backgrounds. To ensure an inclusive and diversified learning environment, additional handouts were created for learners that may require extra support. As well as this, learners were informed that they could request learning materials prior to the session. As previously mentioned, a blended learning approach will be used to develop the specified skill sets in learners. By using a combination of digital instruction and one-to-one FaceTime, learners can work individually with new concepts. In turn, this allows me to circulate and support learners, allowing more opportunity to provide individualized support to learners that may need it. Focusing strongly on a student-led learning environment has allowed me to act more as a facilitator to learners than adopting the more traditional teacher role. The learning activity was introduced using a PowerPoint presentation at the start of the session. Although the learning activity didn't take place until the end of the session, it was mentioned early on to provide incentive for learners to focus more strongly on the content materials being delivered. The learning activity will encapsulate all that will be delivered within the first 30 minutes of the session during a lecture period. Problem-based questions were incorporated into the learning activity. This has been partnered with game-based learning. This not only provides incentive for learners, but helps to improve the overall learning experience. The game-based learning activity was completed individually by learners. However, peer communication was strongly encouraged due to the nature of the gaming activity. Observation was the main form of assessment used during the learning activity. This was partnered with a Q&A recap at the end of the session to ensure learning had taken place. Assessment through observation was further utilised, posing questions to named individuals in the group. Learners were also asked to complete an online survey to provide some reflection into the learning activity. This would help feedback feed forward. Using these reflections could be referred to when planning future sessions and creating new learning activities. The lesson topic focused on elements of music production, focusing strongly on bit and sample rate. The learning outcomes for the session included: explain the fundamentals of bit rate, determine the different uses of sample rate, identify the differences between bit rate and sample rate, and list the different audio formats that are used. The game-based learning activity was created using an online medium through a website called Class Tools. Shown here is the game-based learning activity titled BTEC Level 3 Music Production Quiz. Below you can choose from a selection of games, edit the questions, or share the game's link. Questions can be input to the game using a single or multiple choice format, dependent on preference. If learners answer the question correctly, they can play the game they have chosen. If the game is lost, learners must answer 3 more questions correctly to retain their score. If learners answer a question incorrectly, the correct answer is shown. The learner's score is then posted to a leaderboard that all learners can see. This encourages learners to apply knowledge obtained within the session to a problem-based learning activity. As learners would visit some of the questions more than once, this will help to reinforce content materials. Learners will be encouraged to interact vigorously and critically with content through questions. This will allow for deeper learning to take place within the session. To plan for differentiation within the session, an extension activity was created for learners. This would allow learners to create their own gaming activity to share with their peers. This gaming activity would then be created using materials that have been covered within the session. Certain strengths with this activity include: it proved to be a positive motivator for learners. Mentioning the gaming activity at the start of the session did help learners focus more strongly on the content being delivered. The learning activity encouraged positive peer and group communication. The learning activity proved to reinforce content materials. When conducting Q&A, it was apparent learner confidence levels had improved towards the subject material. Noticeable weaknesses with the gaming activity included: a minority of learners became distracted with the use of the internet. Although peer and group communication was encouraged, some learners fell off topic and some mediation was needed. This in turn took away time needed to provide individualized support. Certain elements may need to be addressed if this learning activity was to be used again. These considerations will be included within my detailed written report. To underpin the teaching methods utilised for this learning activity, Bloom's digital taxonomy was referred to, addressing each step within the taxonomy and how it can be directly linked to practice. Planned learning activity aimed to ensure each learner moved through each stage of the taxonomy. Starting at the bottom of the taxonomy, remembering, learners will recall information provided at the start of the session during the lecture period. Understanding, at the end of the session a brief Q&A period will be held. Here, learners will explain and describe materials that have been covered. Applying, learners will apply previous knowledge and knowledge gained from this session to a problem-based learning activity. Analysing, learners are also allowed the use of the internet during the task to research answers. Here, learners can analyse data collected to get the correct answers. Evaluating, learners will evaluate each question and answer in relation to the content material covered at the start of the session. Finally, creating, learners can create their own game-based learning activity for their peers to play. So, in conclusion, was the planned learning activity a success?
In order to increase student learning, we were asked to create an innovative learning tool. it is important to understand what makes my tool of choice innovative. I have never used this tool with any of my students, and therefore it is completely new for myself to undertake. This activity has not been used in any previous schemes of work, and the song used was created specifically for this tool to help increase student learning. Before undertaking the activities chosen, we decided to focus on a blended learning pedagogy to increase student learning. This can be defined as learning activities that involve a systematic combination of co-present interactions and technologically mediated interactions between students, teachers and learning. Once we decided on this pedagogy, each member of the group could then adapt the activity to our own individual learners. The activity I have chosen is a form of formative assessment that will allow students to evaluate their own work and understanding. During the session, I was able to deliver feedback whilst the students were working and question students as to why they have applied a particular technique. Students are also able to scaffold their own learning by highlighting areas for future development. The learners involved with this activity were second year students on the Creative Sound and Music BA Honours course, studying the Advanced Studio Techniques module. Within their first year of study, the students briefly explored different studio techniques, and therefore the majority of students lacked the confidence with mixing and using and applying these techniques. The group of learners consisted of individuals from a wide age range, primarily males, and a mixed diversity. When undertaking the activity, only 4 students were in attendance, 2 females and 2 males. Before undertaking the activity, the students were given a session which focused on the concepts being taught in order to allow room for scaffolding. The lesson focused on building the learner's skills and knowledge in regards to mixing with low frequencies. The use of SMART objectives within the session allowed for measurable targets to be achieved by the students. Throughout the lesson, I allowed room for the students to try out and experiment with the concepts being taught. For this, the students were given a link to a Dropbox account in which they were able to download the individual stems for a track they would be working on for this activity. When showing a certain mixing technique, such as EQing and compression on a kick drum, I would then allow room for the learners to try out these methods for themselves, while showing them how to do this on Pro Tools through a projector at the front of the learning space. I gave the students plenty of time to try these techniques, as they can be quite complex, and it was crucial they understood the main factors before moving on to the next technique. The track the students used was a composition I made specifically for this lesson, and was deliberately kept to a minimum of stems in order to allow the students to focus on the main concept of the lesson. For example, the audio tracks included a bass, kick, snare, hi-hats and synths. After the initial presentation and demonstration, students were then expected to carry out the activity. Students were expected to mix the composition they downloaded before the start of the session using the techniques taught. They were then required to demonstrate the use of EQs and compression, especially with the lower end frequency instruments, for example the kick drum and the bass guitar, and mix these effectively. In order to cater for differentiation, an extension task was set in which students had the opportunity to mix the whole composition. This allowed them to have more practice with mixing as a whole. As mentioned previously, the group decided to increase student learning through the blended learning approach. Therefore, the learning activity was based around developing students' communication skills as they were interacting and assisting one another, critical thinking skills, teamworking skills as students delivered feedback to their peers, employability skills as the concepts being taught are vital for use in a professional environment, and digital literacy skills. Students were using Pro Tools and Dropbox. Throughout the session, a formative assessment method was used, in which I would listen to the students' mixes and offer feedback. I also allowed room for the individual students to discuss their opinions and any concerns or difficulties they were having, which allowed me to assist them further, and allowed them to evaluate their own work and understanding. This also permitted the students to have the opportunity to scaffold their own development by emphasising areas for further expansion. After the initial mixing activity, the students had the opportunity to show their work to their peers. For this, the students emailed me their mixes, which I would then download onto the Mac at the front of the room, in order to play through the main speakers. Before undertaking the feedback session, I explained to the students useful ways to deliver feedback to their peers, by noting positives and areas for improvement. At the end of the feedback activity, I then gave students time to complete an evaluation of the whole session. The questions allowed room for the students to voice how useful or beneficial they found the session in regards to their own development. Each question allowed room for the students to explain and develop their answers. Some of the questions posed were as follows. Before the activity, how confident were you in mixing low-end frequencies? After the activity, has your confidence increased, decreased or neither? Explain. What part of the activity did you feel was most valuable to you? Explain. What part of the session did you feel was of little or no use to you? Explain. What went well? Judging from the students' evaluation and feedback, the session was very useful in developing their knowledge and understanding of the topic. The students that had taken part within the activity expressed that they felt their confidence had increased after undertaking the task, and they found the practical elements of the activity useful. I feel the blended learning approach worked extremely efficiently. The students were able to assist one another, meaning that they were drawing from one another's experiences, and the practical elements of the session allowed students to understand the concepts more fully, as they had to apply and demonstrate the techniques shown. As the class consisted of 4 students, I was able to help individual students as they were mixing. This allowed me to explain concepts in further detail or to break down certain techniques, and this seemed to work well. The feedback session proved to be useful as it gave learners a chance to express their own opinions on each other's work. Students demonstrated good use of positive feedback as well as expressing areas for improvement, which allowed for peer assessment. The feedback session also allowed the students to explain the reasons why they used a particular technique. For example, I stressed to the learners that they didn't have to EQ and compress as long as they were able to justify their reasons behind this, allowing them to make self-assessment on their own work and development. Areas of concern. Due to the limited attendance of the learners, I felt that my original idea of splitting them into pairs would not have been effective. As a result, I felt that it was more useful for students if they were able to practice these techniques individually. This did have its benefits, as it allowed me to assess each individual's knowledge as they were working on their projects, allowing me to focus on each student on a more one-to-one level, especially as only 4 students were in attendance. Students weren't exactly eager to complete evaluation forms, and there were complications with uploading the tracks onto Dropbox, as students didn't want to set up an account. As a result, I asked the students to email the tracks to me. I felt that it would have been beneficial for them to upload the tracks to a platform in which they could all access and listen to each other's work. However, some students simply refused to create a Dropbox account. I did also offer alternative websites such as Google Drive, but again the majority refused. They seemed to be very hesitant of putting their work onto a platform for the rest of their peers to access. This may be due to varying confidence levels within the group, although they were happy to display the work for the feedback session. The speakers available in the learning space were of very poor quality, and I felt this was a problem as students weren't able to hear the techniques being demonstrated, especially in regards to the use of EQ and compression. For example, when I was demonstrating the use of an EQ on a kick drum, students were finding it hard to notice any changes. The majority of the students were also using poor quality headphones to mix the tracks, and refused to loan good quality headphones from the university, in which they all had access to at no charge. I tried to stress the importance of this to the students, but they expressed concerns of hygiene with using headphones that others had used. All in all, I feel that the activity worked very well. The feedback I received from the students was very positive, and I feel that this outweighs any of the problems that occurred. That is not to say the tool worked perfectly or couldn't be improved, however, but upon reflection I feel the session did help to increase student learning. As the concepts taught can be quite complex, I feel that the students benefited a tremendous amount, especially as they were able to try the techniques taught in a practical and supportive environment.
Good afternoon. For my part of the presentation today, I will be talking about how I attempted to increase student learning on the topic of referencing. My students that I was working with were first-year students on the Professionalism and Governance in Cybersecurity degree course. Creativity and innovation in education are not just an opportunity, but a necessity. Creativity has been defined as a product or process that shows a balance of originality and value. It is a skill and an ability to make unforeseen connections and to generate new and appropriate ideas. Innovation is the application of such a process or product in order to benefit a domain or field, in this case, teaching. Therefore, innovative teaching is a process of leading to creative learning, the implementation of new methods, tools and concepts to which benefit learners and their creative potential. For this assignment, my peers and myself collectively agreed that we would aim to increase student learning through the blended or flipped learning methods. Flipped learning reverses the traditional classroom approach to teaching and learning. Flipped learning is an attempt to make the best use of the learning benefits of online and face-to-face teaching. Direct teaching is taken out of the classroom and put online so that students learn through instructional videos, activities, and presentations. The activities for this session were an online quiz and paper handouts. With the blended learning method, the classroom becomes a space for dynamic, interactive learning where the teacher guides students to apply concepts they have learned online. Before the students could be given the quiz, prior scaffolding had to take place. This was in the form of a tutor-led lecture on referencing the day before. Smart goal setting brings structure and trackability into goals and objectives set. This was the underlying principle when formulating the objectives for the lecture. The lecture covered terminologies and definitions that were relevant to the Harvard style of referencing. Students were also given the opportunity to put theory into practice by having a go at referencing various sources that I had brought in, as well as looking at more unconventional sources such as referencing public lectures and referencing YouTube clips. My aim was to therefore take what the students had learned during the lecture and further increase their learning during tutorials the next day. The activity session ran over 3 separate tutorials. Before the tutorial, I had arranged the room to better accommodate groups. Upon arrival, students were given a number which corresponded to a certain table. This method allowed for a random group selection. On the tables were consent forms that I had designed, as I wanted to record evidence of the students undertaking the activity. My mentor was also given a consent form as I had asked for her to be present for the first tutorial. This would allow her to give feedback from a mentor and current lecturer's point of view. I took time to explain how the session was going to go and ensured that all questions were answered in order for the students to be fully informed before signing the consent form. For my online quiz, I used Quizlet.com to design a quiz that was based around the referencing lecture I had delivered the day before. There were a set of 20 questions which were divided equally among the groups. The method of flashcards was used and displayed on the smartboard. A definition or question would be presented and then the group was given time to collectively discuss before giving their final answer. The questions for the quiz were designed around Bloom's taxonomy. This meant that the questions started from basic knowledge level and progressed to more complicated questions where the groups were required to use higher order problem-solving skills in order to answer the question. An example of the lower level questions was, give a definition for a bibliography. Students were only required to recite or state what they had learnt in the lecture. Another basic level question was that students were asked to define what secondary referencing is, and again, students only had to state the answer. Moving up in Bloom's taxonomy, students were then asked to compare and contrast. An example of this form of question was, what is the difference between a reference list and a bibliography? In order for students to answer this question, they had to know what both elements were before being able to differentiate between them. An example of Bloom's application level can be seen in the following set of questions. These questions give the students a set of information that they then need to break down and structure into the correct answer. I ensured that each group was given a question from each of Bloom's taxonomies. Not only was I aiming to increase student learning with this activity, but getting the students to work in a group had its additional benefits. The first of these benefits was that I was able to assess the class as a whole and get a general idea of how much had been understood by the students from the lecture, but also who the students were who were at a higher level of understanding and who those were who still needed additional support. The use of various levels of questions ensured that all could take part in the activity and that those who were at a lower level of understanding still had an opportunity to contribute to the discussion. The more advanced questions then included and catered to those who took away more from the lecture the day before. An additional benefit to group work was that the students were able to learn from each other in peer-to-peer learning, and that some of the more confident students were able to help the less confident students. Employability skills were also improved upon in that in order to successfully complete the tasks, students had to work together in order to achieve a shared goal. Communication skills and problem-solving skills were crucial in order to answer the question. The online quiz took about 30 minutes to complete. After that, students were given a handout I had drawn up based upon the lecture. This element of the session was the face-to-face aspect of the blended learning approach. Again, these questions were based around Bloom's taxonomy and contained knowledge and comprehension-based questions, application questions, such as taking the information provided and correctly structuring it based on the Harvard style of referencing. The most difficult questions came in the form of incorrect reference sources, which the students then had to highlight, state, and rewrite the reference correctly. Unlike the online quiz, this activity allowed me to move around the room and engage with the groups at an individual level instead of as a whole. It was from this that I was able to assess individually who the students were that needed additional scaffolding and with what area of referencing. This took 15 minutes to complete. As it was Valentine's Day, I had brought in boxes of chocolates, and the group that answered the most questions correctly were awarded a large box of chocolates, and for participating, each group was given a smaller box to share. After the worksheet, I had allocated the last 15 minutes of the session to giving the students time to complete an evaluation form I had drawn up. As I mentioned previously, my mentor was present for one of the activity sessions and was also given an evaluation form. However, her questions were different to that of the students. Questions I asked my mentor were, for example, did you feel the learners worked more collaboratively and think more critically? Did the learners engage more strongly with the learning material? And did you feel the session enhanced progression and levels of achievement? Just to mention a few. The types of questions the students were asked were, what part of the session did you feel was most valuable to you? Was there any benefit to you doing the tutorial this way? And did the learning activities you took part in today add value to your learning experience? With each question, students were asked to explain their answers. Despite the many strengths of this session, it was not, however, without its limitations. Having to rely on technology can have its problems. With regards to my activity, the internet connection in one of the building blocks where I conducted the activity was very weak and resulted in gaps in the quiz that needed to be filled while waiting for the next question to load. This was mitigated somewhat by going over the previous questions if it was answered incorrectly. Another limitation that was noticed was that while one group was presented with a question and taking time to discuss, this left groups not having anything to do. Although they were told they could steal the point should the group get the question wrong, this did not leave them with much to do. This is not such a big issue with a small class, as the groups would be asked questions one after another. The problem came with the larger classes with potentially 4 to 5 groups. This meant that while Group 1 was discussing and answering a question, it was a while before Group 5 would have their turn, which had the potential for students to disengage with what was going on and the activity and possibly become disruptive. Although there were limitations, the general feedback from both the students and my mentor was that the session was a success. And although an online quiz is not a new form of learning and assessing, with regards to these tutorials and these students, this approach was new and innovating. As I conducted the session over 3 tutorials, I have only taken a sample from each group's feedback. Some of the feedback I received was that the tutorial was made more exciting and that it made referencing easier to understand. There is a growing desire for a holistic transformation of the educational systems, and innovative teaching methods is a step in the right direction. This is because it attracts the students' attention in the classroom, it makes them interested in the subject and eager to learn more, it stimulates their minds and makes them understand the subject material rather than just memorizing it. The use of the blended or flipped style of teaching allows for students to increase their knowledge beyond the tutor-led lecture. This is because learning together creates a shared mind that combines different perspectives and alternative ways to problem solve. Thank you.